Hi students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the Populist Party, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab and take some notes. Earlier in the unit, we looked at two big problems during the Gilded Age. The first was the lack of government regulations, or laissez-faire economics. And the second was limits on democracy for many members of society. Today we're going to look at some of the people and groups who wanted to reform this problem. So let's start by reviewing the problem. During the Gilded Age, corruption was rampant in all levels of government, and rich businessmen routinely paid off congressmen to pass laws that favored their business interests. In addition, African American men were not allowed to exercise their voting rights in the Jim Crow South, and women could not vote in most states. All of the reformers that you'll learn about in the next couple lessons were trying to fix these problems by expanding democracy and giving more Americans a voice in government. Let's start with two groups of people who joined together to create their own political parties. Before I tell you what a third party is, write down these two examples of third parties during the Progressive Era. The Populist Party was a third party that represented farmers, and the Socialist Party was a third party that represented factory workers. You might remember that Upton Sinclair was a socialist. Okay, now let's look at what a third party is. Traditionally in American government, there are only two political parties who compete for power, and we call that the two-party system. During the Gilded Age and today, in 2022, the two parties are the Democrats and the Republicans. And Americans have a choice between which of those two they want to vote for. But what happens if people feel like neither of those two parties deserves their vote? In that case, people might join together and form an alternative party called a third party. So a third party is any political party that is not one of the two major parties. Third parties have rarely had much success in getting their candidates elected, and a third-party candidate has never won a presidential election. But, and this is the important thing about third parties, their goal isn't really to win, it's to influence one of the two main parties. Let me say that again. The goal of a third party isn't really to win an election, it's to exert some influence over either the Democrats or the Republicans. Let's imagine that it's a presidential election year and the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate are competing in a tight race. Each candidate is trying to get as many voters as possible so that they win. But neither candidate is doing anything to help a certain group, like factory workers. Parties are just ignoring them. So a factory worker forms a third party and promises that, if elected, he will pass a minimum wage law. And this promise is something that a lot of factory workers like. So millions of them decide that they're going to vote for this third party candidate instead of the Democratic or Republican candidate. But the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate want those votes, and they're worried that if they don't get them, they'll lose. So what does one of the candidates do? He adopts the third party's ideas. Suddenly, one candidate is promising that he will pass a minimum wage law if he's elected. And just like that, the third party has accomplished its goal. Their candidate won't win the election, but they've managed to influence one of the two main parties to adopt their ideas. That's how third parties work. Now let's go back to those two third parties from the Progressive Era that you wrote down before, and let's look at the Populist Party. The Populist Party were also called the Grangers, and they represented the interests of poor farmers. Farmers at this time were having a hard time making a living because they had to pay outrageous fees to railroad companies in order to ship their goods to cities where they could be sold. Farmers hated the railroad companies, most of which were owned by a few robber barons, many of which were monopolies. The robber barons controlled government by bribing corrupt congressmen, and the farmers found it difficult to create change. The populists thought that the two main political parties had been corrupted by the wealthy, and they promised to give poor people more power over government and to break up the railroad monopolies. Okay, let's look at two reforms that the populists proposed that became widely adopted. First is called initiative, and it's a process by which citizens can bypass their state legislature and propose laws to be voted on. According to the U.S. Constitution, only Congress members can propose laws and vote on them. But initiative lets anyone propose a law, and if they can gather enough signatures of people who support it, then at the next election, any citizen can vote on it. This lets citizens bypass Congress, which is helpful if Congress is corrupt and isn't passing laws that people want. The other idea is called referendum, and this is a process that allows citizens to vote to reject a law that was passed by Congress. And if voters reject the law is voided. So if Congress passes a law that's helping corporations, the citizens could call a referendum and reject the law. Both initiative and referendum expand democracy because they give everyday citizens more influence over government. Here's a map of all the states that have now allow the referendum process. 23 states adopted it, most of them in the West, because that's where support for the populists was strongest. New York State does not allow referendum. Now it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of them, just rewind the video and look again. And I will see you in class. Bye, students.